So we do have an action-packed lineup for later today, so I want to make sure we're not too late regarding lunch, but luckily we have some lunch options very close. So I want to do this panel discussion, again, as interactive as possible. Ask one question for the panelists to respond. That'll be hopefully a catalyst for your comments and your questions, and the rest is up to you to ask your questions to the panelists. The topic that we have, human rights and austerity, the path ahead. So this is actually the final panel discussion for the conference. So I think the idea is to look a little bit towards the future. What can we expect? What should we be awaiting? And I wanted to just ask a simple question with a complicated answer. Even though you haven't had a chance to prepare for it, I'd love to get your spontaneous response. And I think that might actually serve as a catalyst for the further discussion. In each of your opinions, what do you see as the single most important challenge to the protection as well as the enforcement of human rights over the next 20 years? So what do you see as the single biggest challenge? Over the course of the conference, we've discussed transparency, legislation, all kinds of different factors. What do you see as the single biggest challenge to the protection and the enforcement of human rights over the next 20 years? And do I have a volunteer, someone who would like to go first? I didn't give anyone a chance to prepare for this. So who would like to jump in first? Yeah? Okay. Yep. We'll just pass it around.
Yeah, I think my contribution would be the danger is the loss of confidence, I think, in the international community in human rights as being a way of regulating normative behaviour across the economy, across social behaviour. We see that very clearly in Europe, I think, which brands itself as being the home of the Enlightenment and the home of human rights, but in fact the political elites in Europe, I think, are actually turning away from human rights. There is a strong sense of cynicism that they now impede them in taking the type of actions that they want to take, which is generally driving forward their austerity programs, depriving people of a standard of welfare provision, the levels of social protection that they've had in the past. And human rights stands in the way of that, and because of that there's a drive to try and limit the authority of human rights judges and human rights courts in being able to rule on these issues, and even a suggestion that there ought to be a wholesale withdrawal from important instruments. And that's a challenge to us. How do we reconstruct that? How do we reconstruct confidence in the ability of the international community to actually hold together a narrative that's about the rule of law and its the benefits that we all get from it?
Thank you very much. Who would like to go next? Maybe you ladies?
Can I also give a very brief introduction about what I'm doing? Because yesterday I told you that I've been within adult education, and to be more specific, I've been working in a foundation or a school called Austerity in Finland. And since 2007, I've been training both long-term and short-term unemployed, both immigrants and Finnish people also. Which means that they are more or less discriminated and very passivated people who are in need of motivation. That is what I'm trying to do, motivate them. So it's a big challenge because in order to learn, the motivation is the most important thing, right? So I'm dealing with integration, and I am in contact with these people who are in need of integration every day. And imagine a classroom full of people, just like we are here, and they are all so very different. There are immigrants who have been living in Finland for 20 years, and they still don't speak Finnish, for example. There are immigrants who suffer from post-traumatic stress, and it goes on for a long time. Of course, it's a process that they need a lot of help, and then there are well-educated, young, and very motivated people as well. So a very different heterogeneous group. And within adult education, the core thing is to see the individual, right? Because we are all different. Someone said yesterday, I think I heard someone saying that we all have same world view. I have to say that I strongly disagree. Of course, we have this very strong ideal about how we wish everyone to be equal and that we can really implement everything that is said in the human rights legislation. But I think that each one of us, we have all different worldview. And we have been talking about, just mentioning about also religion and so on. And religion is a very strong determinant to cultural identity. And in practice, when you try to integrate these students, young and old, and age and everything affects on everything. So it is a really big challenge. And of course, in order to understand people, because that's what we are doing, and that's our goal, to understand each other and respect each other, and there we need very, very good communication skills and empathy, of course. I really like the thing that you said, Jessica Walker, about the ability to see, how the other person's from the other person's perspective. It's really, really important in communication, and we know that it's really difficult even if we have the same language and we have a fluent language. But then when we come from so different cultural backgrounds, I don't want to highlight too much of the differences, because the bottom line, yes, it's true that we are human beings and from the same race and everything. But in reality, we have been talking about these attitudes and how to change attitudes. Well, media, good quality of media and good quality of education. And I can see in Finland also among the teachers, like Professor here said about lack of competence. Also among the teachers, I can see and hear that many teachers also lack a great deal of competence, and they sort of also have attitude issues. They are not so open to develop their competence within this. But I'm not saying they are great teachers also, of course, and who wants to develop all the time. But yes, and teachers have enormous pressure on them. They have to develop their computer skills, and they have to develop, be aware of the environment, and all kinds of, education is arranged to them, and everybody expects them to be educated more and more and more and more. So this is a problem. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Phelps?
Sort of picking up on the general theme of Don's answer, I think I'd say this emerging differential approach to human rights risks really undermining the whole painstakingly built up edifice. There's always been, I think, an inherent weakness in the human rights concept, the extent to which is not considered as universal, the extent to which citizenship, for example, is a source of rights, and therefore the non-citizen, the refugee, the stateless person don't arrive at that right to have rights. That's a structural weakness in the concept that goes back to the start. It was highlighted by Hannah Arendt in 1950 when we were just drafting the convention. I think it's becoming a particularly fraught point of this fissure. The pressure is growing on it, and there's this increasing moralization of it, this idea that you can undermine human rights by focusing on the bad people who benefit from it, the criminals, the the foreigners, the asylum seekers, the foreign criminals as the worst of the worst. And I think that it puts into question the whole concept of human rights by merging it with these ideas of duties and this idea that you only get human rights if you're not only a citizen but also a good person, or at the very least a good migrant. And I think that's how we arrive at these very extreme treatments of the bad migrant that gets very little attention, very little discourse around in the human rights field and in wider media. So I think that defending the universalism of human rights is crucial.
Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. I'd also probably like to expand that point. Coming from a legal background, the concept of universal human rights, even though you have such concepts enshrined in things like the United Nations, it's still incredibly difficult to implement it on a universal and worldwide basis, I guess. An example I would use is I've recently been to Tibet, and kind of activities going on there. I can't comment because I've seen various things, but I wouldn't like to make any specific statement. But the fact that China may act in a certain way in an age of austerity like we have now, the UK finds itself in a very difficult position whereby it won't want to influence or say that much to China in regards to the process of economic partnership. I think that's a large obstacle to human rights. And I'd also like to say that I personally think an issue that appeals to me, and certainly thinking about human rights in the next 20 years, is the current political situation in Europe, for example, of the domination of the right. I think in the UK we're very fortunate that we don't have a history of extreme right politics, but I think we often take for granted that in the rest of Europe, wherein I currently think Denmark and Austria, there are right-wing or certainly centre-right governments all in charge. And I think often, or not very often, but in the history, human rights amongst the right has often been less respected as with parties on the left. And I think in an age of such economic crisis and austerity, it'd be very unwise to assume that these right-wing parties couldn't evolve into something that could in the future be a real danger to human rights. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Human rights and austerity, the path ahead. This is your panel. This is your chance to ask any questions or make any comments that you like. And maybe we could pass, is the second microphone here, or did the other speaker maybe run away with it? Or if we have it, all right. I think it'll work everywhere except the back row, so let's see if we can get it to work. Okay, and then we'll take a group of questions and comments, please.
Is it on?
No. Or give them this for now.
That's fine, I can shout.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see.
Jerome, it's basically a question for you following from your presentation, really. If we take sort of Somalia as an example, what's stopping basically the majority of the Somalian population jumping basically in the back of trucks, and so there's whichever means within the country, getting basically admittedly incarcerated for a long period of time, which shouldn't happen, but then released. If that's the case, what's the point of having borders if they're getting released? And because I appreciate basically it's very difficult in the back. I'm not saying we forcibly go back in hostile situations, but it's also quite a difficult conflict between what is stopping basically the entire population coming over. Is kind of what are your views on that? And the other thing is, what would you change about the current situation? Because the presentation you kind of highlighted a lot of the flaws, and I agree there are flaws there. But if you had the power to kind of go, it should be this way, this way, this way, what would you do?
Would you like to respond, or are there other questions, comments? Maybe first, why don't you respond, and then we'll take some more. Okay.
Sure. I think on a practical level, what's stopping the entire population of Somalia coming here and turning up on your front doorstep is Fortress Europe. It's incredibly difficult there is a right to asylum. It's a right that's incredibly difficult to exercise, and as a specific objective of policy, European governments make it so. They make it almost impossible to get a visa. they force genuine refugees into illegality, into the use of false documents, in order to breach the barriers of Fortress Europe and get here to claim asylum. Somali, before they get here, there's many countries in between. They might find themselves in Greece, which effectively doesn't have an asylum system. It has hundreds of asylum seekers camping outside the Interior Ministry, trying to get one of the 10 tickets a day to get in and claim asylum, and risking being thrown into the horrific conditions of their detention centres. I think the broader point, I appreciate that's not what you're getting at. The broader point is this fear that entire populations are going to turn up. It's never happened yet. There are very good. It's a very high threshold before people want to leave their country and come to the West. And the populations of refugees in the UK, for example, are tiny compared to. If we take the example of Somalia, the vast majority are in refugee camps in Kenya. Britain receives far less than I would argue is a fair burden of supporting, of receiving Somali refugees, even leaving aside Don's point that it should not be considered a burden unless we deprive them of the right to work. We have signed the Refugee Convention. If people are refugees, they should be given refugee status. If they can't be deported, then it achieves no public policy objective to lock them up for years. People should be enabled to come to places where their rights claims can be assessed and not left to rot in Kenyan refugee camps. There was a second question around what should we do instead? Effective immigration systems. If you want a border system that is effective, which I think is part of the thrust of your question, it doesn't work. The posturing doesn't deliver you an effective border control system. You cannot. No institution of any form, and border control as an institution, works purely by enforcement, by forcing people to do stuff. You have to build in an element of consent so that enforcement, like in a prison, you only use violence as a last resort. What you need is a system based on engagement with migrants, so that asylum seekers, irregular migrants, go through a process that they're enabled to understand, and they're given support, time, advice to make decisions about their future. So if they're refused, they understand why, and they're able to make a reasoned plan for their future life. If you cast them into destitution, throw them in detention, people can't do that. People will fight you, and your system will fail. It's only by getting an engagement, dialogue, and an element of consent in immigration control. That's the only way that you will get the border control outcomes that the UK Border Agency seeks, and it's also the only way to do it that's compatible with human rights.
Thank you. I see a question in the back, also Darnell. Maybe if you could just hand the microphone back, we'll see if there's interference with the speakers. Give it a try.
I just said to move onto the speaker.
Okay.
Move over this way. Move over here. Just move over here.
Okay.
Physics.
Okay.
It'll be interesting to know, this isn't really a question on the sort of the future of human rights, but rather its strength. It'll be interesting to know if each of you consider the capital punishment as an infringement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the right to live.
Would like to take that? You want to take?
The lawyers are in the best position to answer that one.
Okay.
I mean, I guess the right to life is a fundamental human right enshrined in the UN Convention. So, actually, question a bit too quickly. No, it's a very interesting argument, and capital punishment has been ended in the UK for a long time for that reason. Legally speaking, it's an incredibly complicated area to kind of go into. If you use the example of the United States, the specific states that still have the capital punishment, death penalty, I guess, you often see the huge process, the legal battles that go on there. Ultimately, my personal view is that it is an obvious infringement of human rights to issue a death penalty. The obvious argument against it is it's only dished out in such instances where the crimes are on such a basis that it is considered the perpetrator has abused the rights of someone to such an extent that their rights are forfeited. I think that's the general argument, and it's just how you then consider that argument, if you accept it or if you want to argue against it.
From a UK immigration perspective, if you can demonstrate that you would be subject to the death penalty in your country of origin, then that does generate grounds for protection in the UK, and you would be either a refugee or granted humanitarian protection if you can prove it. And that goes for extradition as well, I believe.
Excellent. Okay. Darnell? Okay.
There's been a glaring omission here. Probably not intentional. But one must ask the question, why do people feel the way they feel? I mean, the populations inside of the countries to which other people want to go. Europe, over the last 500 years, has pillaged and plundered the rest of the world. And to some degree, over that period of time, especially if we get into the 20th century, those populations inside of the plundering countries, for the most part, have bought into the plunder. They've acquiesced in it in many different ways. So the education system, I remember as a child, if you go look at an encyclopedia from, let's say, 1949 or 1950, the way that they describe, the exploited areas, we talk about human rights. Well, who is human? I mean, the fact of the matter is, literally, the explanation, the description of those areas which were exploited kind of indicates that those people were subhuman. Now we have the situation of Nazi Germany, and in fact subjugating Eastern Europe and designating those people as being subhuman. So this concept is not foreign to us. So if you live in a situation, or you grow up in a situation where you adopt a condescending attitude, an attitude of superiority, then it's easy for you to look down and disdain at other people. I think it's necessary for people to understand that. So, and then the other thing is the question of how you're educated. If you don't learn that your country, that the crown jewels probably have their origin in plunder, it's going to be difficult for you to appreciate people from other parts of the world. You're sold a narrative which is grossly inaccurate. I'm just 30 more seconds, because Mark always looks at me and says, "Now, when are you going to finish?" No, anyways, I'm just kidding. But seriously, this has to be discussed. What's the mindset of those people on both sides? Because just one little anecdote. Just a few days ago, I was in Görlitzer Park in Berlin, and I was going to the video studio to visit a friend. We were talking about a project, and I passed some people that I knew, and I knew why they were there, because they were selling drugs. But I didn't stop, but on the way back I said, well, I'm going to stop and talk to them, because I was interested in maybe filming them and listening to their story. And they were from Africa. And so I went to the studio and I came back, and I did indeed stop and talk with them. So I'm asking them, why are you sitting here? And as I'm doing this, there's a German woman walking by, and she's being accosted by a drug dealer, and she's telling the drug dealer, "Oh, I don't want any of your drugs." That's her right. But he was very, he was cool. He kind of like withdrew. But out of nowhere came a young black man, and he literally vaulted onto her shoulders. I mean, if you can imagine putting your hands on the shoulders of a woman smaller than you, he vaulted onto her shoulders, looked down on her, and spit in her face. I said, wow, I've never, myself personally, witnessed that kind of hate from both sides, you know. Now, obviously, this young man was in error. I could not ever support any kind of action like that. But it speaks to, in a large sense, to the situation we're discussing here. The situation of these people and how they feel and who they feel the enemy is on both sides of the fence. I just want you to contemplate that anecdote and what that might mean. But the main thing I wanted to stress was we have to discuss why also people feel the way they do. Is it systematic? Is it endemic to the problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments before the lunch break? I'll give the panelists also a chance if they want to give a final remark, but any other input from the participants? Maybe, okay, 2 final inputs. Do we still have the mic? I'm sorry, I didn't see. Okay, please. Yeah, we can just leave it on next time.
Okay. So I've been living in the UK. I'm from Canada originally, but I've been living in the UK for a little over a year now. And one of the things that's really struck me in that time is how the European experience of immigration is drastically different from what I've been accustomed to in Canada. It's especially striking if you consider that Canada, I think, has over 20% of its population that's foreign-born. But we don't have anywhere near the level of political problems, for want of a better word, that arise from the issue and the kind of attempts to undermine human rights discourse as a way of eroding the protections afforded refugees and immigrants. So my question is this: I was wondering if any of you had given any thought to the issue of whether the way in which national identities are conceived in Europe as opposed to in Canada or the United States or maybe Australia, which tend to be themselves as immigrant societies and therefore have a different conception of the nature of the community, whether that might play a role in the problems that you've been speaking to, and whether it might be productive to direct some energies towards altering the way in which national identities are conceived with a view towards improving the human rights situations of immigrants and refugees.
Thank you. 2 more comments and then I'll give it back to the panel, or maybe 3 more comments. We're already 20 minutes into the lunch break, so try to keep them brief if we can. Okay.
Hi, just responding one thing that you said just then, I would actually argue that Australia is one of the most difficult countries in the world to get into. We're one of the most hostile countries in the world towards immigrants generally. But the reason why I separated out illegal immigrants and refugees before is to do with Australia's attitude, because if you are British and you come into Australia and you overstay your visa, you're not presenting a problem for us. But if you fight life and limb to get across an ocean because you're being persecuted in your home country and wash up on the shores of Australia and say, please don't send me back, I'm going to die, then you are a major problem for us. Now, the reason, what I guess I would like people to address in private conversation, if we have no time to hear, is this question of creating a space where we can talk about why that is so. Because my fear moving forwards is that obviously everyone here, we have in common that we're interested in human rights, whichever side of the political divide we sit. My neighbour and I are quite starkly on opposite sides of the political divide. And yet we can have a conversation about human rights because we are all human rights activists in one way or another. But the people we're dealing with outside this room aren't necessarily human rights activists. And my fear is that in making the dialogue very emotive and trying to create a space that we perceive as a better world, what we're doing is in effect a form of prohibition. We're pushing underground the very behaviour that we need to be engaging with and unpicking, because not many people, when you actually have a rational conversation with them, are prepared to come out and look you in the eyes and say, well, you don't understand. They're actually second-class citizens. They're not worth all that. not many people actually think that way when you pull it all apart. So my passion personally is in creating space where we can have the dialogue and have the rational conversation and try and create a better world through that conversation.
Thank you very much. Let's try to take a few more from this side, and then we do have to come back to the panel. You guys can help me. I'm not sure exactly who was first. All right, maybe the first two. Okay.
Hi. A quick question. I was wondering, I know with human rights, how we're all trying to come up with a standardization for it and a universalism where we could expand it to across the board to the world. I was wondering, how can we do this and create this universal aspect of human rights and not impinge upon traditions that have been ingrained into some religions or cultures, what so have you, around the world, and at the same time preserve what we have as human beings. And I was studying yesterday. What you call this in Judaism and Christian religion and Muslim, they have what's called FGM, female genital mutilation, and that's ingrained for hundreds of years in some religions, and we all know that that's against rights, and we all know that, but how do we go to them and say, this is wrong, and how will we get our point across and not cause conflict? And I think that's what we're here for. But I wanted just to get what your first steps would be to doing that.
Thank you very much. Could you pass the microphone just back one up?
Daniel touched upon China, and it just got me to thinking how the current shift in economic power in the world towards countries that have been often questioned on their human rights stances, including China and Brazil and perhaps India. Where does that leave us? And I wonder whether it will have a positive or negative effect on human rights overall worldwide.
Thank you, and I think there's a final... No? All right, we'll save it for later then. Okay, well then I'd like to give it back to the panel to maybe use this chance for a final comment or reflection. We're a little bit under time pressure, so I'd ask you to keep it brief, but feel free to respond or engage any of the comments that were posed. Maybe we'll start ladies first, and we'll go from left to right, if that's okay?
I would like to, when you asked about the European situation, Europe is also, of course, very different from Finland, for example. There's always been, or there thousands of years, there has been multiculturalism, definitely, because it's in the middle of Russia and Sweden, but because of their history, with their struggling to be independent, to become an independent country, and all that has an effect, of course. And now, actually, Canada has been a model for us all the time now. Until, I don't know, have you been following the news about Finland and the situation there? Current situation is that the far-right party, which is called True Finns, had a scarcely increased popularity in the elections during the spring, so the atmosphere is terrible. But it's very different from the other European extreme right parties. It's more about anti-EU and also about anti-Swedish speaking Finns, because it is a bilingual country. So, and the linguistic strife there, and all that. So it's, yeah. So I don't know, but I am very hopeful because now we have actually, brought up the whole issue, and people get more conscious, and now we have, because we've never discussed it, openly about these issues. And also when you said that nobody comes public and says that, I'm a racist or there's something terrible other people, but actually in Finland we do. Yes, leading figures in media, and they, it's unbelievable. They also use this argument that we need immigrants in the future because we need labor force, and this also there is a risk that people start to use it very wrong, like we need the immigrants because we need clean floors, and this is the situation in Finland. Thank you.
I think a lot of the questions are all sort of pointing in the same direction of why do we feel the way we do, or why do people feel the way they do, and what do we do to overcome it? And it's possible to sort of talk ourselves into a fit of depression about all of this, because referring to all the very obvious facts that there's a lot of racism, there's lots of xenophobia, there's lots of anxiety out there. And that's reflected in the way people feel and behave. I think there's another story though that certainly exists, and I'm not being naive to deny that it doesn't exist. But I think the other side of the story is that there does seem to be substantial parts of society who are actually relatively impervious to the racism and the xenophobia and the all of this really bad stuff. And in the UK, that it keeps cropping up in public opinion polls, where everybody goes on about 70% of the population are chronically anti-immigrant and seem to be totally irreconcilable to the idea of immigration. And you end up missing out on the fact that there's 30% of the population which are very, very resistant to that idea. And they're a strange bunch of people, this 30% of the population, because there's no political party that represents them. There are hardly any significant movements in the media, certainly no tabloid newspapers act and reinforce the viewpoints that they've got. There's possibly a couple of the broadsheets, The Guardian. But generally speaking, everything seems to be against them, but they're still there. They still hold the views that they do, and I presume that the people who have come along to this meeting today are a pretty representative group of people from that 20-30% of the population. And in my view, a lot of the questions that have been asked here now is how do we create the space, how do we universalise human rights values without tramping on traditions and values that people also hold very dear to themselves. China, that's an issue that keeps cropping up on that. What do we do about the rise of China? Well, the obvious thing to me is that we talk to Chinese people. We actually find out what Chinese people think about the world that they seem to be finding themselves rising into the ascendancy. Day before yesterday I was in Nottingham with a group of Chinese students, 30 formed themselves into a society, the Now We Community International, which is all about getting maximum value from being a Chinese student in the UK, being able to change their minds as Chinese. They want to take something back to their own country which reflects the values and experiences that they've learned. No doubt not stopping being Chinese as a consequence of that, but actually becoming something else as a result of the experiences. And that's a long answer, but that's what we need to do more of. We need to sit down amongst ourselves. We actually have to see ourselves as not, pessimistic, a last redoubt of liberalism, but people who we exist because of what's been going on in the 20th and now the 21st century. Our experience is as valid as the experience of the racist and the xenophobes and the nationalist. And the issue for us is to build up the projects, to build up the opportunities for solidarity, to build up the messages, to build up the campaigns that actually allow us to move from being 20-30% of the population to 40, 50, and hopefully the majority at some point.
Thank you very much, Jerome.
Thank you. Absolutely, I think background of imperialism is absolutely the gap. Very valid criticism of my speech is starting in 1950. I know you weren't. I don't. No. Starting 1950, you miss which I did for practical reasons, you missed the background of where do these camps come from. The genealogy of detention centres, very briefly, is nothing to do with prisons. It goes back through refugee camps, internment camps, concentration camps, back to imperialism, the Boer War, the camps. The totalitarianism was camps were to a large extent an importation back home of the techniques refined in our imperialist adventures. Again, reading Arendt here, and I think you can see that through to the space of today in Colnbrook and the treatment of migrants there, who are on some level very much. I think people very much do see them as second-class citizens. We are still in the grip of this mythology, this nightmare of imperialism, and these repressed but still very potent feelings that people have that have been embedded through our racist imperialist adventures. How do we wake up from this nightmare? And there I agree with you on the need for rational discourse. I think that's what both Don and I have been trying to do with our various campaignings, is to demythologize, talk past some of these, what passes for that frank debate on immigration that politicians are constantly calling for, to see what actually is the effect of migration, to bring, to show the benefits of migration, and also to enable migrants themselves to be present in this discourse. I think it's vital that we get beyond just talking about migration as an abstract, as numbers, and we work alongside Don's Chinese students, my indefinite detainees, the migrants themselves. It's one thing to conclude, one thing that I think you often see when you talk to the xenophobes, people with these very problematic attitudes, is they focus on abstracts. It's not their neighbour, it's the abstract asylum seeker. For the real lasting change of attitudes, we need to work with the migrants themselves, to tell their stories, to communicate them as human beings, and that's how we get back to this universal sense of rights and humanity.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the previous two speakers for their attempts to uplift everyone before lunch, but I'm going to hopefully try and bring the doom and gloom back. Kind of thinking about what Darnell's question was, or statement about the concept of human nature almost in relation to human rights. I'd like to draw on the example of the most fabulously insane place I've ever lived, being Israel. I lived on both sides of the divide for over a year, and the concept of a country that was formed in 1948 as purely based on an immigrant population who had obviously been through incredible atrocities, to then produce a society that is divided in such an intricate fashion, firstly through two areas of immigration, Europe and the Middle East, the Ashkenazi and Sephardian, then the second division between male and female, third division between religion, specifically secular Jews and non-secular Jews, and then not even going into the obvious issues of Arabs within Israel, and then the Palestine-Israel difference itself. It just seems to me that there cannot be a situation where human nature doesn't dictate how we perceive human rights. I think it's very clear that in such an area where human rights and these society divisions are so clear, and history of how this place